question though before we start.
Yes, go ahead.
Inevitably, when we say something that needs to be edited out of the podcast, you're just gonna give it like the raw audio.
Yeah, I'm gonna give you raw audio, all the individual microphones, and then I'm gonna give you each what each camera records. So you guys will have everything to edit.
Oh, cool. Beautiful.
Yeah.
Do you do your own editing?
Yeah. Jesus. Well, I never do video editing.
Yeah, we do it all.
I just do audio editing.
Mike does all of it.
But it doesn't take that long.
Really?
Whatever the length of the episode is, that turns into how long it takes to edit typically.
Huh.
Just put on like 1.75 speed and just like bust through it and, you know. So.
Oops.
I think I like attempted to edit our 4th episode ever, Trevor Harris.
It's easier with people, because, you know, when you talk and you're going through a long monologue of an answer or whatever, people who are just really clean and well-spoken, like, it's so easy. But then you look at guests who say or like or very, very, very frequently, and like, then that's the most frequent edits.
But Riverside, you don't edit on Riverside. No. When I make the clips, it's easy because you can just see where that's at.
It's interesting, like, being able to like tell people, like, you know, like Stu, for example, right? You just listen to Stu go and like it's fine. You don't touch it, right? But then like someone who like has never done a pod before and that's the first time, like typically there will be a lot of, which like I don't have to edit them out, but I also just feel like listening wise, it just sounds a little better. So.
Yeah, we use Descript.
Descript?
Yeah, so you just put in the words you don't want in there.
Oh, nice.
So you'll put and like and whatever, like you can put all those like filler words, drop the file in.
Is that some AI shit?
Yeah, we've been using that for a minute though.
Like we were just talking about how we need to like better utilize AI.
Descript we've been using for a minute. Like I use that for fashion mechanics.
Oh really?
Yeah.
The thing that we've been thinking about and talking about is we need to figure out a way to turn our podcasts into Chinese and into Italian and into Spanish and just like pump it out to the masses, because
there's got to be an easy translation.
Sure. Well, you can find like websites that will like, hey, if you have 3 people on your podcast, you can pay this website to have 3 French voices do your podcast.
Oh.
But it just like costs a lot per episode.
Talk with Stu.
I did hear Chinese labor is relatively cheap, so depending on what you're trying to do.
There we go.
Is that why we should talk to Stu?
Talk with Stu, yeah, because they translate all their products.
Oh.
Does the laptop look bad in the video?
No, it looks fine.
Yeah, China's a crazy market, man. There's so many people, and they're just getting access to stuff. So if you get on the Billy even.
Yeah. So we're ready to record. We're rolling. So whenever you guys are ready.
All right. So we still have 2 hours, so we have plenty of time. We don't have to rush or anything. But
let's see where it takes us.
Anything on the front end?
No, I don't think so.
You guys had a chance to look at the questions a little bit. I'm excited about this conversation, just because it's been very front of mind. But good dive in.
Yeah.
All right. So we'll ask like some targeted questions, and then we'll just kind of ask some more open-ended ones, and we'll just kind of roll.
All right, and just keep in mind that try to keep the mic. They float, so like move them closer to you if you have to, but just a fist away. And if I point to you and I'm like that means gotta move a little closer.
So it sounded good, ain't it? Yeah, you're feeling it.
That was nice. All right. First thing up, so tissue tolerance, and this was particularly interest of mine recently, so I think it's a good place to dive in, and I think also, especially having you two on, very, very interesting. So first question is understanding what that exactly means, but specifically I'm going to start with like return to play. And when you're coming back from some kind of traumatic injury, whether it's like ACL or an Achilles or whatever, patellar tendon tear or whatever it is, there's like this thought I need to balance building the capacity of that specific tissue, but I also need to balance just giving the athlete a comprehensive movement strategy, because as you get into the bandwidth of injury, you probably are reducing what's happening movement strategy-wise, or like you're creating some kind of compensation. So when you're balancing mechanical loading versus just movement strategy, where do you start? Where do you go to? Do you do both at the same time? Do you start with one and go to the other? What's that incorporation like? Dan, you want to start?
The other way I like thought about this is, and it kind of makes sense in my mind to think of like local versus global, which I think you would agree is that's like also what you're getting at now. It's like a local focus versus a global focus in a return to play setting with a specific injury. Obviously that's local, but then how do you like incorporate the global?
Yeah, so to speak to the tolerance point first, like that's what I name my first phase of RTP is tolerance, right? And I think of course, depending on the severity or the complexity of the injury, the first thing that we're trying to do in this RTP phase is reacclimate them to a new body. So if we have anything that's been surgically repaired, right, or removed, resectioned, anything like that, it's a new body, and they have to become familiar to that. So those early phases of return to play, the tolerance speaks to the pain threshold, it speaks to the load threshold, and then relatively the velocity or the dynamic threshold. So that early phase, you guys alluded to it a second ago, is going to be very locally driven. We have a specific point that we're trying to, quote unquote, fix or correct, and tying that into the, reintroduction of them having this new limb, this new joint. We got to figure out where that new baseline is. So the trouble that Chris and I have particularly is very, very rarely do we get pre-injury values for somebody. Very rarely. Working with Les more recently, that's increased a little bit, but almost all the time we're working with kind of a blank canvas. So metaphorically, philosophically, and then literally and tangibly, we're starting with blank canvas. This is a whole new thing. I think the tolerance window is where we are also kind of getting them to this recognition point of what is the work that's set out in front of us. That first couple of weeks, I don't monitor much. I'm not really interested in numbers. I'm not really interested in, what your force plate data says. Like right now, let's just kind of get things moving, get things rolling, and every day is going to be, somewhat of a auto-regulatory approach, where it's going to depend on all these different factors. So getting out of that first 2-week phase, this is where we're going to now try to kind of set a new baseline. So this is where we will start to work in, whether it's simple isometric testing or it's simple counter movement jumps or it's even just gait analysis. This is where we're now kind of putting this new ground zero down. So now the tolerance gets compared to that from that point forward. And then we just build off of it from that end. To the complexity piece or to the dynamics of movement, are you guys familiar with the control to chaos return to play model or continuum? I don't know who to credit that to. I'm not sure who the exact authors are,
It's
but
like a Danny Foley thing.
it does, doesn't it? Yeah, no, it does.
It's not?
No, it
It
does.
should
Sounds like
work.
I know it's widely utilized in Premier League and in in a lot of soccer communities, and I want to say that Aspetar maybe is the genesis of that. If not, they've utilized something similar. But anyhow, the point being is the closer that we get to this point of return to play, the more chaotic the process needs to become. Right? So in this early tolerance phase, it's very local, it's very isolated, it's very controlled. We have simple variables, simple measures. We're just trying to kind of focus on the component. As we get closer and closer to that chaos point, that's where we start to introduce more velocity, complexity. We start to think about it in more of an integrative or a global approach. And then now with that end of the spectrum, this is where we really want to try to strain the area, and we want to really try to focus on the dynamics of movement and how many different ways can we express load, torque, force, velocity, all these things through this area that has been injured. So it starts off pretty linear, and then it kind of becomes a little bit more blended as we go along, right? And the reason for that is our eligibility to do stuff throughout the timeline. And whether we're talking about an ankle sprain or we're talking about a complete hip replacement, we have very little things that we're really eligible to do early on. As we go forward, we should be able to introduce more and more pretty much every time we see them. We should be able to do a little bit more in theory.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point because you are limited to what you can do with
Very
the
limited.
severity of an injury.
Very
Like if
limited.
you're dealing with post-op ACL, all right, you're pretty limited in what you can do compared to what they can do if they were.
We can joint pump, we can do some local isometrics, and we can try to do some modified gait stuff, and even on a lesser scale injury, like, so we're working with a NFL guy right now, who's coming off of had some injections done and had chronic calf strain. So the severity of the injury wasn't ACL level or Achilles level, but per this protocol of the treatment that he had, we can't do anything for 2 weeks.
Yeah.
So we spent vast majority of the time walking, modified gait patterns, doing some modified spring ankles, doing a little bit of joint pumping, doing some tissue work. And then once he was cleared through that window, we took that foundation that we established, which was very rudiment. And then since that point over these last 10 days have been adding something almost every single day.
Chris, what is your thoughts on that? Like, I feel like this is a good like kickoff point for like everything we want to talk about, but I think that like, again, the way I like kind of think about it in my head is like local versus global approach, but then Mike also put it in a different way. What are your thoughts about what Danny just explained in terms of that topic?
Yeah, I think kind of the main point is what's going on at that point in time, right? So when we get someone, where are they at, right? So if it is immediately after an injury or following a surgery, then there's definitely protocols that you have to take in any, circumstance. I think also we just define what tolerance is, right? So there's like not failing, but then there's also making sure that it does what it needs to do. So there's a local approach, but regardless, there is always this global thing happening, meaning they leave the session and they're going to figure out and self-organize on how to compensate around whatever happened. So whether we want to or not, there is a global kind of interaction after the fact, right? So to Danny's point, we have someone who's coming back, we're gonna focus more locally, but let's see how that gait pattern works, right? How does it kind of translate after the fact? And then from there, make some assessments, make some judgment calls, and then, okay, what else can we kind of add in at a local, but also a low level for the time being, right? Because what parts or like what qualities of tolerance are we trying to improve on, and when can we kind of increase that? So there's probably always a local to global aspect, but the ratio of time spent on task is probably what dictates more.
What would you say when you're in whatever stage of that process is, what is your bandwidth for movement strategy allowed within that, and how do you like come up with that? Like, does that make sense? So you have this athlete who has whatever very obvious limitations, but you're still doing some level of movement with them. You're choosing some movement strategy with them. So like, how do you decide what bandwidth to stay within each of those stages?
Well, I think, what Danny said earlier, whenever we can get something of collected, meaning like data, right? So there's some type of reference point, movement strategies and how they actually move. I think one thing that Danny mentioned earlier that kind of brushed quickly is, it's a new person, but this is a great opportunity to work on anything and everything else, right? So it is a component part that we are looking at from an injury perspective, right? But it's still just a component part of a person.
Yeah.
So how does that individual kind of figure it out themselves, self-organize through what they're going through? So they do have a strategy preference, right? And we don't want to take away from that. We always want to give them access to what they're great at. But if we see, let's say, deficiencies, and we can slow things down, we have opportunity to capitalize on those movements, positions, shapes, patterns, and the organization through it. I think we kind of just make those calls based off, okay, numbers are improving. We clearly have a little bit more of a window. Hey, mechanics, though, seem to be failing. So what does that mean? So there's always going to be that observation by the coach, whether you're looking at data or movement. But back to the movement signature that you were kind of saying is, how do we give them the qualities to do more of what they do best, while we also kind of help them work on the things that they were, I don't want to say deficient, but maybe just weak at.
Yeah, it's like a holistic approach. One of the things that you said that like got my wheels turning a little bit, this might be a little bit of a tangent, but this idea of like compensation, and typically people talk about like compensation occurring like after an injury, they're gonna compensate around the affected area. Whenever you're dealing with something like this broad term of compensation, because of a locally affected tissue, obviously you have to like reintegrate that tissue back into like a global strategy. But when we're actually talking about like that process, is it better to attack it from like a local perspective, or like try to immediately reintegrate the tissue back into like a global movement? I think it's kind of what we've been just talking about, but kind of centered around this idea of like compensation. And when you notice that's occurring, it's like, do you attack the tissue to get it functioning better, or do you like try to reintegrate it back into the global pattern? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
The compensation stuff, I mean, we could have a standalone talk on that for 3 or 4 hours. This is one that I've kind of have been flowed on for a couple of years, right? What I've taken from this is like the more clinically driven you get in terms of the research or the input, the more like bastardized that term becomes, and then the more sport-oriented you get, the more neglected that term becomes, right? So you'll get people that are like, oh, well, the best athletes are just gonna find a way, and well, and I think that there's a degree of truth to that, but then at the same time, like, we can't just chalk everything up as being path of least resistance, athletes are always gonna find a way, because what it ultimately comes down to is the distribution of stress and forces throughout the body, right? So I'll use this example, which we'll probably reference her a few times throughout this, but we just finished up a 5-week off-season program with Katerina Macario, who's one of the best soccer players in the world, and one of the best humans that I've ever had the privilege to work with. And Kat has a reasonably complex injury history. She's 25, playing Premier League soccer, U.S. national team, very, very high level, has had some problems with the knees. The knee surgeries, both were ACLs bilateral. Knee surgeries were 9 years ago for one and 2 or 3 years ago for the other.
Wow.
So some space between those, right? But then since that most recent one, we've had some back things, and we've had some foot things, we've had some hamstring things, and we've had this and that. So I think about it like this. An ACL injury is fundamentally changing the lower body, period. No matter what the graft is, no matter what the procedure is, like, you are changing the kinematics, the osteokinematics, the arthrokinematics, you're changing the pressurization between both feet, changing the force capacity. So the athlete, back to this previous point, is going to quote unquote find a way. That's what high level athletes do, they find a way. But then at what point does that start to create a consequential effect? And I think this is a perfect example of it, where this athlete had significant injuries, continued to play at a high level, probably got really good treatment along the way, really good strength and conditioning inputs, but by 25 was already having chronic persistent pain. So what do we do about that? Well, we have to take the initiative to, number one, try to identify the drivers, first and foremost. Don't treat the symptoms, but identify the drivers, which is what Chris does exceptionally well. Number two, we have to manage everything. We really have to try to manage every input of her performance for as much time as we possibly have. And between myself and Chris and Les, we did an excellent job of that. And I give most of the credit to Les on that. Les does an unbelievable job of oversight when it comes to workload management, accels, decels, velocities, all these different things. So we looked at it as address the central problem first. Central problem is the local problem. We had significant surgeries on both knees. So there's something going on there tissue-wise. That was my role. Once we get that area addressed, now we work either up and or down the chain, because we have something in the back, we've got something in the feet. So this is where Chris and I start working more in tandem to look at it from a tissue perspective or a structural perspective, a kinematic or a functional perspective. So what does the gait look like? What do the movement patterns look like? And again, this is Chris's expertise, is watch her run one time, and then boom, 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 we gotta do this. Then number three, we have to manage precisely what the workload is, what the recovery periods are, what those regen inputs are, and then try to get as much of a buffering behind this as possible. So the sleep and the nutrition and all these different things. So what I think happened here was we correctly identified the drivers, which doesn't always happen, but it happened here. We had a very clean program for 5 weeks with very high level of control. We had a phenomenal athlete who was very autonomous throughout this. And in 5 weeks, we eradicated pain, like zero pain, for the first time in multiple years. Improved in fitness, improved in power output, improved max velocity, improved acceleration, improved deceleration, everything was improved. So while she still has some compensatory strategies, to get it back to that point, where we separate within compensatory is it pragmatic? So there's no real optimal or ideal movement that just is blanketed across. There's the context of the individual that we're working with, and then the relative pragmatic strategy that's needed. And some of it may not be necessarily contemporarily correct. But for this athlete within this sense, we feel like we hit on that. And that's kind of how we went about it.
I know you probably have a follow-up.
A couple.
I do too. And I want to ask about something specifically you said that Chris does well.
You're not
and it's
asking
the,
about Chris.
no, I'm gonna ask Chris, but it's something he said that.
All right, good.
And I feel like it's gonna be tough to answer, because I feel like when he was saying, you watch them run and boom, 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 I wanna get into like the boom, 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 boom. You know what I mean? Like, that's really hard to do, because I feel like it's just like reps of seeing movement and everything. You got something?
I do. So I want to unpack the whole thing you just talked about, but I think we start with Dan, then go to Chris.
Sure. Whatever you think, man.
We can rock, paper, scissors for it.
We good. Well, let's go, because you talked, let's unpack the cat example for a little bit.
I do like that as like a case study. I think it'd be interesting. I don't know how much like information you guys are like able to talk about with her specific like program, but I think that is like a really interesting case study to kind of like discover of the.
We can certainly talk about enough that's needed. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Because I think that whole like process of like digging into like that process that you guys just had with her of like what the program looked like from your guys' lens, what you guys dug into, like what training treatment looked like, I think is really cool.
And it's also probably beyond like the scope of what most practitioners have access to in terms of.
I think the
Right,
control.
but-
The control is
For
the
sure.
biggest thing.
Great,
Yeah, that's a huge
great
one.
example of what like high performance could
Yeah,
be, right?
should
So-
be.
Right.
Because
Yeah.
like in the college setting, I control 1 hour for sure of the guy's day. And then it's like, have a hand in the next 2, and then the next 21 are completely up to
Godspeed.
And
them.
they go to school at Arizona State.
And they go to school, so. But like with this setting, obviously you're not like living with her and doing everything you can with her, but also like a professional athlete comes, I think, just like a little bit different buy-in of like, okay, this is literally how I'm getting paid. If you advise her like, hey, do this tonight, or don't do this tonight, or do this, like she's probably gonna be pretty compliant.
Well, there's multiple layers to this. So 2 things. Number one, it was an extreme blessing, like having the autonomy having the control over the situation from a managerial standpoint is fantastic. Having an athlete of her caliber and of her just human level, off the charts.
It makes you feel
You
like
know?
shit. I'm not even able to control like anything. Like when you have that level of
man,
control,
it
it's
definitely.
like, shit,
It really
what
is,
am I
seems like the perfect example.
It
of,
was,
right?
because the other factor here is technically, especially for Chris and I, right, when we're contracted into situations, we are effectively doing the same thing with Les. Les is effectively just contracting us, but we're all working together. So the thing that stuck out to me with this one was like, man, what if I had the compliance and the compatibility with all these other coaches as we did with Les?
Yeah.
Because we talked every single day, right? Every Sunday, we had a full hour-and-a-half meeting just dedicated to her, primarily dedicated to her, talking through the plan, revising and reviewing what the last week was. So it was just done correctly. Now, here's the other thing is like, what it reminded me of is it took me back to my time at DHP, where it was super controlled and it was super measured, and we had accountable athletes that were all about their business, that they were going to do everything they were supposed to do. You know, so it took me back to that time. And the point that I'm making here is that it also reinforced and reminded me of what are the most important factors when we are looking to restore injury or even just improve performance, right? And I got a little bit sidetracked on this over the last couple of years because I became very biased to the tissue side, right? And my bias started to kind of override my vision. And I thought too much about the specific strategies, you know, on the table, or the specific loading patterns, right? And became negligent to some of these more big rocks. And now, you know, the message that I've been pushing with the performance therapy side especially is we can do all the most high-tech, expensive, super detailed, super nuanced, practitioner-based things and lifting protocols. But if you're not managing workload and you're not putting in the appropriate speed doses and you're not coaching the speed and the skill correctly, then you're wasting your time.
Which this like shows the power of, and this is something we talked about when you were down at ASU, is like the ability to, I mean, I think the ability to kind of like work for yourself plays a part in this, but like you're able to team up with somebody like Les and work with his athletes, not just like, hey, let me pop in for a day and see what you do, like work with
Real
his
work,
athletes,
yeah.
work together,
Right.
and now you've been given the ability to kind of like adopt some of his strengths
Oh, yeah.
to your guys' methodology.
Yeah.
And it's made you such better practitioners. And I'm not saying I can't do that in a team setting. I'm not saying Mike can't do that on the team setting, but
Dude, it's tough.
it's
Yeah.
It's hard.
maybe I could say you can't do it. like, you know, like go work with somebody as like a contractor, I think it's like, but it's just really cool to hear that. But I do want to for sure dig into this, and I do want to start with the initial assessment process and what he talked about. And I know that it's like some of the watching movement and determining intervention based off of just watching movement is not something that you can just explain in a conversation or a podcast.
But it is a superpower. It's coaching superpower.
It is, but it's just so interesting to hear like how different people view movement and how like, and obviously it's like case specific of looking for certain things. But maybe we take this athlete for example, and like when you saw her move, what were the things that you were seeing, and then what did that take you to in terms of issues, intervention, so on and so forth.
Yeah, you know, first off, Danny's very generous when he says that, so, you know, whether I watch it one time, I don't know about that, because it's very rare that I feel like I have any answers. It's much more kind of curiosities and questions. So if I see something happening, I kind of just wonder why.
Yeah.
Why might that be happening? Is that a compensation? Is it a strategy? And then if it is, why? And then what do we kind of, I think we talked about it a little bit, like what do we define as good, right? So
I think also, just to interject real quick, like what do we define as healthy? Because we had a conversation with Kyle Sammons, and it's like, we were talking about his framework, and he talked about it a lot, and I was like, well, what about with healthy athletes? And he's like, well, what do you deem healthy? Because realistically, if you're working with athletes at a high level, they're not healthy. You know what I mean? They all have issues.
they should all have a return to play.
Well, kind of, like they're all
It's just
returning
training.
something to play because something screwed up.
Yeah, and you know, so I guess whenever I'm looking at anything, right, and just like we do in whether it's the setting of a weight room, on a field, on a table, we just kind of get curious. And then we go back to the principles that we've studied and known, we go back through our experiences, and we try to filter out and funnel through what could that mean. And then we kind of correlate it with the injury history, whatever we have been told, or the data that we have seen. We try to make sense of that story. And sometimes we have to dig in, right? All of a sudden they're on the table and you're seeing some stuff. Hey, did this ever happen? Or did you ever feel this? And then all of a sudden new answers seem to appear from the individual. So it's not that you know, you just have to keep asking questions and then you get curious. And then I think obviously the more you kind of study and look at whether it's just biomechanics, neurology, biology, what do you know about that? And try to make sense of it as what you're seeing. So where are the energy leaks? Where are this pattern? Why could it be this way? So when I see things happening, right, I really just ask questions, to be honest with you. So for her, in particular, right, I think the easiest way is kind of talk about the quadrant strategies, right? So for her, we kind of have found that she had a little bit more of a boundary strategy. So what does that look like, right? And then what qualities about that do we want to keep? What qualities about that do we think might we be able to improve, whatever that means? And then we really have to correlate with what's going on with her, right? So if we do see certain things that are common with that kind of mover, right, then we know we want to implement some sort of strategy that at least addresses that, or at least acknowledges it's probably better. Before, you know, addressing, at least acknowledge what we're seeing. So now that we acknowledge what's going on, an idea of where we want to head, what are those ideal doses or perceived ideal doses to at least start with? And then you kind of have to see what happens. You know, I think Stu talks about it a lot as far as, you know, fail safe and safe.
Yeah.
Geez. Safe to fail experiments.
Yeah.
And we always do that. Everything that we do is about that. So I don't think it's really much different. But as you start to see things and you have an idea of where they fall on a quadrant map, and then you kind of look at the qualities you're looking for, what's it look like with force, with velocity, control, repeatability, right? As you go through all of these, what seems to be, not efficient, but what could be helping them more if we added this, that, or the other thing. So when we talked and kind of addressed, you know, for Achilles or calf stuff, one thing that we've noticed a lot is that the feet, for the most part, seem very under-addressed, right, in most situations and cases for whatever reason.
What do you mean? What do you see in a foot to make you draw that conclusion?
Yeah, and we talk about foot and ground interaction a lot, right? And how you use the ground determines a lot of what happens in the air when you push through it. So we look to see what just the forces kind of look like. And then if as they move, what could that force line, right? I think Dan Path even talks about it. As their trail is coming through even, he's looking at that path of travel. What could that mean? Now he is an individual who can see something and know right away. I have a bunch of questions, and then Danny just hypes it up to make it sound good.
I spent a day at Altus when they were doing their ACP event, and I was just like watching Dan. Dan was luckily there, and I was just like watching him I was watching him watching athletes sprint, and he would just be like tilted head, like hands up by his face watching, and then they'd walk over and he'd like say something, and I always was just trying to get close enough to like hear what he was saying, because it was like, this guy's a wizard. But anyways.
And then you left thinking about getting into real estate.
Yeah, because I was like, if that's what like an elite coach is,
Yeah.
I don't know if I'll ever get there. Because that dude is
Yeah,
insane.
well, I don't think we need to be so ambiguous about it either. Like, there is good, there is bad, there is better, there is worse. And I think the thing with the quadrant strategies, and for anybody who may not be familiar with that, we're
Yeah.
referencing the James Wild quadrants, which has been some unbelievable work that Altus, Les, a whole bunch of people have kind of adopted over the last couple of years. So basically, it's just organizing athletes based on run strategies or motor preferences. And we're looking at it from ground contact time and flight time, stride length, and stride frequency. All very objective things, and all things that people can measure as long as you have an iPhone, right? Now, this is certainly not my lane of expertise, but the point I'll make off of this is that as somebody who is absolutely terrible with understanding sprint mechanics and how to make people faster, what this did for us was it gave us a unified and really simplified language. Are they spending too much time on the ground, too much time in the air? Are they not striking fast enough, or are they overstriding or not striking far enough? Okay, cool, I can make sense of that. And then, as Chris alluded to, there's these associating soft tissue sites and joints that are quote unquote vulnerable based on these different preferences. So for instance, if you're a bounder, you have a higher propensity for a calf, Achilles, and a foot injury. Well, why is that? Well, you're spending a lot more time in the air, which is creating more force at ground contact, and then because you have a longer stride projection, you are pushing off into plantar flexion a little bit more heavily, and then thus jeopardizing connective tissue quality of the foot and the lower leg. So from a performance therapy standpoint, it just really kind of helped to simplify the work, or at least organize it, where if I know nothing else about anybody, but I know that that's their run strategy, okay, I'm gonna make sure I put particular emphasis onto that. Whereas if I'm a driver or a spinner, it's gonna be a little bit more hip-based because there's more of a torque demand rather than a ground demand. So that helped me quite a bit.
Yeah, it's very powerful for performance and for manual therapy, performance therapy, like both sides.
You know, the interesting thing that Les said about it is it helped me make sense of your world, and I think
Yeah.
it helped you make sense of my world.
Yeah.
Because when we've shared privately, over the last couple of months, some of the challenges of that initial relationship, right?
Yeah.
And almost all of it came down to incongruent languages and definitions, which it always does, right? So over these last couple of months now, the three of us have really kind of started galvanize and say, okay, now we understand what we're really working towards, and we understand what each input is kind of working at as it relates to this athlete with this mapping or kind of procedural net of these run strategies.
It makes me think, I know I've been just
No,
flowing
sure.
right now, I'm sorry,
You're
but it makes me think like there are a lot of other, I don't want to say quadrant systems out there in terms of like defining strategy, but I think of it from like a force plate and potentially like CMJ lens, and like P3 has done different research on like
Great work.
stiff flexors, hyperflexors, hip flexors.
Yep.
And that's from like a performance lens per se. But all James Wild did with his quadrant with this system is then just like look at, because I remember when I was up at Altus hanging out, Stu was talking about this same exact thing, and he was talking about I don't know the quadrants very well, but he was talking about it, and then he showed like there's actually been research done on the as you alluded to, the injuries that occur in each. And it's like, why couldn't you do this for that P3 study, for example, with like stiff flexor, hyperflexor, hip flexor? Those athletes that assume those strategies, which is probably more relevant for like a basketball or volleyball player, why couldn't you create the same system for something like that? Like stiff flexors are going to deal with whatever, patellar band more, hip flexors, I don't know, post train, whatever. Like I don't know the answer, but like you could almost apply it to a lot of different like quote unquote systems are out there, and I think it would create some sort of common language between performance and medical practitioners, as opposed to like us speaking these weird like different languages. It's like, oh, we're dealing with a hip flexor, or a hip flexor. I'll train him this way, you need to treat him this way to try to like mitigate the risk of injuries that we see in this population.
We talked about this way back, maybe I guess last year, the year before, about force and connective tissue-based movers, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Now, there's
for
no systemization of that.
For sure.
And yes, when you start to try to get technical on how you differentiate those two, yeah, there's a little bit of ambiguity to it, but I think for the most part, for most of us, it's kind of intuitive. If you've got a short counter movement and you just
Yeah.
spring off the ground, you're probably using more of a connective tissue strategy
Yeah.
versus if you need to squat deep to get off of the ground, it's probably more force-based.
People ask me all the time, like, how do you determine those? And it's like, just look at their counter.
Just kind of watch them move, yeah,
The
you
counter
know,
movement
and,
depth is like, and again, you don't need a force plate for that. It's like,
right,
what
yeah.
depth do they choose to jump from? And that gives you a really good idea.
And we don't need to get granular beyond that because what it does not predicate what the answers of the test are, but what are we all working against? We're all working against efficiency because we all have a reduced amount of time that we have to work with the athletes that we have. So if I can clean up and expedite even 15 minutes of a 60-minute session, that's a huge thing. It's a really huge thing. So now we get back kind of to this, strategies and compensations and what's good, what's bad. Well, when we're in a return to play phase, pain is going to be the number one precursor, right? If they're in pain, we're having problems. So we need to figure out why that is. Now we're going to kind of get beyond the pain point, and now what are we kind of looking for? Well, we're looking at what is their preference in terms of how they move, and then how do we facilitate that?
Yeah.
And then this has become my big heuristic for this year, is like, what is the difference between health and performance? Difference between health and performance is balance and precision. When you're aiming for performance, you have to be very precise. There's very specific things that we're aiming for. There's very specific metrics that are going to help guide us to that. When we're trying to get healthy, we need balance, period.
For sure.
Like, so from a tissue perspective, if I have this bounder, I know that we need to focus more on muscle as opposed to connective tissue. Now, when we're in the performance phases, we flip that.
It's like kryptonite and
Now we
superpowers.
got, you know what I'm saying? Now we got to feed what they use.
Yeah.
So I think that, quite frankly, we kind of have the easier aspect where it's like, oh, okay, they load predominantly through their connective tissue. Well, let's get a little bit stronger.
For sure.
And let's do some soft tissue on the connective tissue. And here we are,
So let's go back a little more applied to this case with Kat, for example. You said the first thing you did was address the knee pain. So bilateral knee pain, I'm assuming.
Mm-hmm.
Understand that she is a bounder, or you have a bounder that has knee pain.
She was playing with that. Like, she wasn't like injured off the field. Like, she was just playing in pain.
She's had a couple of, she's had some on and off time.
Yeah.
Yeah, on and off time, yeah.
So with her or in general, you have this person who you can fit into the quadrant system. Hey, they're a bounder, they have active knee pain. Are we assuming that knee pain is then causing the back pain, or the combination of movement strategy to knee pain is then causing back pain?
I'm looking more of that. I'm looking at it from three things. The sport that they play, and actually I guess I'll just tie into like sport they play and then their tenure within the sport,
Okay.
right? Because that's a factor too, and I know we'll talk more about that on this. But number two is, what's the injury history? It's the most objectively concrete thing that I can go off of. And again, you can become presumptuous with that, but I think at the end of the day, specific injuries create pretty specific things, and most of the time that's pretty consistent. And then number three is the strategy, right? So now I have sport, gender, age, strategy, injury history, and then boom, what are they doing right now? What do they need to do right now? So we work off of that.
Is there any difference with her? Okay, it can be her, it can be just in general, but let's say you have a bilateral ACL. Does the actual surgical intervention, like graft type, does that play into your thought process at all? Especially if it's like patellar versus hamstring versus whatever?
Yeah, basically at this point, like if it's if it's not a patellar,
It's
then why did you get the surgery that you got? But no, when we have different graft types for ACLs, we'll say, right, you have two injuries that you're dealing with,
Yeah.
right? So for a patellar graft, you're dealing with an ACL and a patellar
Yeah.
injury. If you have a hamstring graft or a semitendinosus graft, then you have an ACL and you have a hamstring injury, right? So that's really kind of the main thing. I don't really get too far beyond that. If you talk to somebody probably like Kyle, can give you a much more depth or detailed answer on that. But for me, it's the number of injury sites, and then I just want to kind of see, what the tensioning of the surgery is. Because one thing that I noticed with the military guys with shoulder injuries or shoulder surgery specifically, boy, is there a lot of difference in that, in how tight they anchor those things back down, especially with labrums. Big differences on those.
I was talking to
Why would that change though?
I mean, different surgeons do different procedures and they have different beliefs. And you know, for us dummies who are in the
Right.
strength and, you know, performance side, we're just like, oh yeah, surgery's a surgery.
Right.
Well,
That's still what I think.
yeah, not even close, you know, and they have their, you know, micro differences and different
Yeah.
opinions. And, you know, for some people, or for some surgeons, it's like they believe that we should anchor the site down and not give it a lot of laxity. And there's more clinical reasons as to why you should or shouldn't do that. But, you know, again, as it went with the shoulders, with the labrum surgeries, you know, where that anchor site is within the labrum, how much of the collarbone are they going to, you know, kind of excision or take off? Is it, or if it's a Mumford, you know, where are they going to reattach a bicep head? Is it gonna go to the acromion or is it gonna go to the coracoid? Like, so those are different things, and that's gonna change what the potential of the return to play is, you know?
I mean, 100%, I think 95% of performance coaches, and I feel very comfortable saying that, because I think even that's generous to give 5% some levity in this, is that like, oh, athlete had surgery, okay, every single surgery is considered the exact same.
I hear really smart people say things,
But yeah, like Dan
and
Pat-
all of them talk about, I want to talk to the surgeon
Yeah.
immediately.
Yes.
Post-surgery, and
Yes.
I'm like, yeah, me too, for sure. Call him up right away, definitely, dude. But like, really, it's just like, but hearing the intricacies of different things and like getting more exposed to it, it's like, oh geez, even as simple as like my roommate in college tore his ACL, and he was talking about where he got his graft from. I was like, what? Like they pulled like
Autograft
this was
versus
undergrad
allograft,
hunter, like no idea what about anything. And then now it's like you're injuring another tissue
Right.
to heal
Right.
this tissue, and like you just said, like you're either dealing with a hamstring injury or like a patellar injury, and then it's like you got to deal with both too. And it's just like that's a huge aspect of return to play of an ACL.
For sure.
You know, like you have to know that.
Now, unfortunately, because ACLs have become so common in sport, there's probably much less variance with an ACL surgery
Yeah.
for athletes than there are for, you know, other surgeries or for other people.
probably for very high level athletes.
You know what I'm saying? And
You know?
yeah, I mean, like, and for the NFL, you know, it's like there's only a handful of doctors
Right.
that people are even going to really seek out for the high level guys. So, you know, you're going to get some consistency on that end. But, you know, I think a more applicable conversation as it relates here isn't necessarily just the surgery type, but the amount of ligaments that were torn. So with an ACL, there is a big difference between an ACL solo and then an ACL plus an LCL or ACL plus an MCL or plus a meniscus. So the amount of damage that occurred during the injury is probably more significant for the performance coaches than necessarily the surgery type or the specifics of the procedure.
Yeah, that makes sense.
What's like your immediate thought when it comes to solo versus ACL plus LCL?
What my invoice is going to be.
Sweet.
The ligaments of the knee are very directionally based, right? So you take this to the forces and the directionalities, and really if we have different ligaments that have damage and we have an MCL versus an LCL, well, we need to prioritize or preferentiate towards those directions that ligament,
Yeah.
you know, resists, so
Makes
to
total
speak.
sense
Yeah.
to me. Okay, so back to this case study that we keep touching on. And it's as much as about the like training program and it just like understanding the team that you guys work within, and with Kat for specific example, you two and Les were the main party handling that. So like Chris, what was like your role in this process? Do you guys kind of like do the same thing together? Like talk about your role, like what you kind of like took responsibility of within her process, and then same to you, just to understand like the dynamic of this process.
Yeah, a lot of, you know, as we kind of have identified a little bit of using the structural, functional, technical model, the easiest way, if you were to just say 1, 2, and 3, would probably have been Danny, myself, and then Les, but all of us interplay with it,
Yeah.
right?
Sure.
So most of the table work was going to be done by Danny, right? So once we had this, let's say, tissue window, we'll call it, we would move it into a little bit more of like a biomechanical window, right? So how do we now integrate and kind of educate is usually the term I like to use. How do we educate this system to use these component parts as they are now either released, activated, and so forth? So that functional portion before the session, sometimes coaching within the session, and then also coaching during the strength session as well. So for me, and I guess that kind of falls into the movement observation, is really the particular coaching and trying to make sure that whatever interventions we're using, or even just the coaching of the movement, are a little bit more accurate or precise, either to her and her strategy, or the weaknesses that either have been from a tolerance perspective, is it the tissue tolerance or is there now a mechanical tolerance because the tissues cannot hold the integrity of position?
Sure.
So what parts do we need to coach at what point, and how do we say the least while getting the most in return? So for my part, it was probably more heavy pre-session, as we also had scheduling obligations during a lot of the main sessions. So I was sometimes stick around for some of the primary sessions where mostly that was less. Very rarely was I there, but when I did, it was usually just coaching on particular parts or little coaching cues in between. And then during the strength portions, just more the intricacies of how she was moving during the exercise.
And how much of that was novel for her? Because you talked about experience in the sport. She's A, been with Les for a long time,
Mhm.
B, playing high level soccer for a very long time. But now as she's dealing with chronic pain, obviously things have to change in terms of her movement strategy. So is this very novel for her, and slash how quickly is she able to pick up on these changes to movement structure?
When you say, is this novel, when you say this, you mean like what we did as a whole?
For her specifically, in terms of trying to change the way that she's moving to get her out of pain.
I don't think we necessarily tried to change the way she moved as much as we tried to make sure she could, I guess for lack of a better term, move a little bit more efficiently, right, to kind of what Dane was saying. So if we're having this reoccurring or occurring dysfunction or issue, let's say from a calf and Achilles, well, why is that going on? What can we implement now? And then how can we just use these next 5 to 6 weeks in order to get that to a place where it's not necessarily going to be the lowest hanging fruit anymore, right? Kind of trying to get multiple component parts equal or closer to about 8 out of 10 compared to one thing out of 10 out of 10. Again, to another Altus analogy. So I think from that perspective, those were usually the goals. How do we address some of the component parts within a global movement strategy, so that there is actual carryover for her nervous system and system as a whole to make sense of everything and self-organize.
It's so crazy. Me and Mike were just having this conversation before we walked in here of all the individuals that are, and it's becoming much more commonplace nowadays. And I think, at least in the world that I'm in basketball, like very commonplace of individuals, let's say within the NBA, to hire a person or people to operate around them in solidarity as opposed to just relying on the team staff.
Right.
And it's like, it makes total sense because you could have an entire year to study one person's body, and unless you're God, like you're still not going to figure out the whole thing. So it's like, to me, with these individuals that are continuing to make more and more money, that are continuing to be put at higher risk because of the demands of the sport with games and travel and all this stuff, it's like, yeah, if you're a high level athlete, why wouldn't you try to create like this ecosystem around you of people that are focused on you? Because there's so much intricacies to everything that if they're focused on 14 other people, it's like, don't get me wrong, that's what I do. And I like to think I deliver a decent product, but the product that I could deliver focused on one person for a certain amount of time or for an entire year feels as though it would be dramatically higher.
Yeah, I would say, very quickly before I let Danny hop on this, because I'm sure he's got points, is really probably just a lot of trust and education.
Yeah.
A lot of athletes are put into settings or, situations, and they just kind of have access and they just kind of believe that the people have their best interests and that they're always, at the top of whatever, their best, taking accountability and their best interest, technically. So how do we educate them to the point that there is access for them, right? They may not know that that's an option.
Yeah.
Right? Or there's just over-reliant trust and kind of hope into things that may or may not be working out.
And it's like, it's not even, and I know you weren't saying this, but to reiterate, it's not even a knock on the practitioners in those settings. Like that's literally the settings we're in. But it's like our bandwidth is only so big to focus on any individual athlete.
We had
super constrained.
3
And
people
super constrained.
dedicated to one individual
Yeah,
for
amazing.
5 to 6 weeks. You're
And
talking
that-
about a legit case study.
And the way you broke it down is like awesome in the 3 parts to it. And it's like you, Danny, you're handling this part, you are handling this part, Les is handling this part. You're all like interwoven and dealing in all parts together. It's like, that's a really high performing system, especially when compared to the traditional model of 1 strength coach for 15 guys or football where it's 4 strength coaches for 100 guys. It's like,
Or even like privately, it's like, hey, go to this PT when you're done with this PT.
Right.
Drive 20
Yeah,
minutes.
for
Yeah,
sure.
that's the thing we want to eliminate, yeah. Well, to your point real quick, when you're healthy, you have 1,000 problems,
Yeah.
right? When you're sick or you're injured, you got 1.
yeah.
And at the professional level especially, it's protecting the asset from the organizational view and from the individual view. And the little heuristic or tagline that, Chris and I have used in this sense is, we're here to get you to the next contract, right? And when you're a professional athlete, your contracts come to an end by 35,
Yeah.
if you're
Right.
really, really good,
Right.
So I think
NFL is probably 20.
even less,
Three.
right, even less, and in any case, at any point in time, you're one injury away from this being done,
Right.
and that's not to fear monger, right? Like,
Yeah,
I don't like leveraging it against them, but
But it's real.
it's an
It is.
objective thing.
Especially if you're like borderline.
Yeah, for
like,
sure. Yeah. So I think it's this kind of now bringing this back around to the example and to the role that we're playing is, number one, we've seen athletes in all sports at all levels that have wildly different abilities, wildly different strategies become successful, and throughout history, we've seen athletes that treat their bodies like they're science projects, and that we get everything like super technically dialed in, and then we get other athletes that eat Skittles and McDonald's and sometimes hit a yoga class and then they go play.
Yeah.
Right? I love the Anthony Edwards quote, right? Because it's fascinating to me. But case in point, the constant across all of those is you got to be healthy. You have to be healthy to play. And I think that with athletes now become like this is now cool. It's trendy. LeBron spends $1.5 million. Derrick Henry spent, I think that's cool, and obviously biased and selfishly that helps us out.
Sure.
But, I do think it's very important. So to finish on this, example here recently, we keep getting interjected on, or
It's
sidetracked
cool.
on.
We're bouncing around a different.
Yeah, hey, we got no rush on time.
Yeah.
We didn't do anything that was probably magnificent or crazy on paper. We trained 5 days a week. We had a regen on Wednesday. Every day was some combination of table time, movement integration, motor repatterning, speed, conditioning, strength. Les took about half of the strength stuff, and then we took half of the strength stuff. So I would say for those interested, half of it was boring and basic, and half of it was effective and sexy, right? We did not squat her one time. Nobody did, not one time,
No type of squat.
none. The primary heavy loading was through hex bar deadlifts, kickstand, and landmine presses were our heavy loads. We did some pulls, but really that was it. We emphasized a ton of spinal engine. We emphasized a ton of core, hip, adductor, and I would say probably 20% of the total input for the strength training was dedicated specifically to the lower leg and foot. Now, what was missed earlier in the conversation is what we identified with her specifically, and again, this speaks to a lot of athletes, is poor motor tone in the foot. Just very weak intrinsic foot muscles. And so again, we go back to kind of...
How do you identify that?
Yeah, touch.
Okay.
Touch, and then isometric manual testing, right? That's the...
You can also see it from shape, but for the most part, you gotta see some feet.
Well, that was one of my questions too, because it's like you can look at the foot slow-mo sprinting, but then there also is, I'm assuming, all the way zoomed back to literally just laying your hands on it to seeing how it just like stands on the ground, right? Like,
Yeah,
it's
no
probably
doubt.
a
I mean,
step by
and,
step
and what Chris and I try to do is just really see it from our own perspectives and then make sure it's aligned.
Yeah.
And most of the time that's the case.
Yeah.
So this is where I go back to what he sees versus what I feel, right? So I get a lot of information from putting my hands on people.
Is that typically correlated? Like you'll feel, let's say, a foot.
It works
and you'll
both
say,
ways.
Hey, I feel this, and you're like, oh, I see that
It
show
works.
up in the global strategy.
Yeah, it works both ways, and quite frankly, most of the time it's Chris identifying it in motion and giving me a tip. I look at him as like being the spotter to the sniper, right? So for
Fire me up. That's
it's
it.
the most important role, right? If he can see, and especially in combine, right, which was moving way too fast for me at the time. So he would have somebody that would be, hey, go see Danny real quick, and then dude would be running over, and he would say, hey, here and then here. All right, cool, let's check that. And most of the time it's right. Now the same thing with Les too. Les will just be much more brief and kind of ambiguous about it.
Yeah.
Like, hey, she's not getting off the ground very well. All right, cool. So probably not very stiff in the ankle complex or very stiff in the midfoot. So let's check that out, right?
Yeah.
So we're all still continuing to learn that language. But to the point, very, very poor motor tone in the feet. We have knee problems. We have chronic persistent pain in the Achilles around the ankle. And then we have some back stuff. So those are now kind of my key criteria. So with this structure or framework of pre-session, movement integration, speed, strength, and then having a bank regen day in the middle of the week, we were basically able to just kind of allocate these things through these different mediums. And again, it's different inputs that are all aligned to a singular outcome, because me by myself, I ain't shit. Chris by himself, nobody understands him. Les by himself, only half the work's being done. So it has to come from all different angles, and in order to absolve pain, which is a complex thing, you have to have the right inputs from each piece. It does not work otherwise, and that I'm definitely sure of.
So let's back up just a little bit. So you said he saw what helped to inform you. So let's say poor motor foot tone. Did you see that as a bouncer? Like, I'm just collapsing into the ground. Oh, there's maybe something happening at the foot. Then for Danny to go look at the foot, how did you identify that?
From a foot perspective, like just based off someone's feet?
Or like, hey, I saw them sprint. This is my tell that, hey, Danny, can you take a look at their feet? Can you, whatever it is you need to do?
I would say sometimes placement, right? Like how their foot literally interacts with the ground. And then what's the efficiency strategy trying to be used? So sometimes there's a really good foot ankle compliance, right? Which is a strategy used so that it can get a little bit more pulsive. But it's not great for stiffness. And we know that we do want stiffness for a firm impact. So where is that stiffness coming from, and at what point in time, and then how much force is actually being used off of it? So sometimes you have stiffness and it's great, but if the timing is not right, well then could that be leading to something else? And then you almost want to think, okay, well, is it doing that because there's not enough surface area to literally interact with the ground? Is it not mobile enough? Is there not enough compliance between foot and ankle? And then why is that? And then sometimes you also can look up the body a little bit and say, maybe it's because the hip is positioning the foot in this way that's not allowing it to comply well with forces in a vertical or horizontal perspective, right? So then from seeing the whole idea, to be honest, again, it goes to the questions, if they were complaining about something, which is usually why they would go to the table, I would just say, hey, by the way, just check this out. I'm curious, right? And then he would usually either say like, yeah, that was accurate, or yeah, it was close, but actually I think this was actually the thing, and then from there we would kind of just move forward.
Really important point on this.
Yeah.
The combination of the tissue work and what we keep referring to as, repositioning or motor patterning. For the strength and conditioning audience, soft tissue therapy has been misconstrued as being purely a regenerative thing or a restorative thing where an athlete is sore or in pain, so we go to do tissue work to get them out of pain. Like, partially true, right? The way that I see the soft tissue work is actually, it's like the most effective potentiation mechanism, right? The interfacing of manual therapy is a mechanotransductive application. We are taking a biomechanical input to create a biochemical cascade. Translation, I'm putting my hands on somebody, we're changing the receptors, we're putting different fluids in, and then that is depressing the pain signals. So what we're doing is we're creating this small transient window where an athlete who has a chronic, level 5 Achilles or knee pain or whatever pain, we're diminishing that down to about a 2. Now, if that athlete does absolutely nothing after that, they're gonna come back tomorrow and that pain is gonna be a 5 again, guaranteed. But when you couple that or you follow that with a very specific foot positioning, placement, pressure, hip repositioning, and then having them hold in an isometric or having them do some kind of mobilization or some kind of, dynamic action, now we are actually kind of rewiring, for lack of better terms, what this athlete should feel when their joints or their body is in this position. And then, if you don't do anything after that, they'll come back tomorrow, maybe good, maybe not, but eventually it's gonna come back at a 5. What you absolutely have to do to make a definitive change on this is you have to put load and velocity through the area. So I diminish or depress the pain levels. Chris puts them into this optimal state or positioning for that day, and then Les puts down the appropriately dosed speed, change of direction, conditioning, and then coaches it and cues it correctly based on what their run strategy is, and then we finish it by adding load through strength training in these different positions and patterns that we're looking for. That's kind of there's the secret sauce, for lack of better terms.
The idea that a reduction in pain, and I feel like I'm paraphrasing potentially, but ultimately, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but like a reduction in pain is the ultimate potentiator. Because
100%.
I think when I played basketball, and my left knee in particular always hurt. And on the days that it didn't hurt, I was like, oh man,
Yeah.
like flying.
Well, you can be you.
Yeah,
Right,
exactly.
and all athletes are always, and we talk about this often, in general population, a lot of times,
Yeah,
they're moving at 80%, and you give them 4%, they're like, you changed my life, I feel amazing. Athletes get to 95%, they're like, I'm dog shit. You know what I mean?
No.
So feeling, look good, feel good, play good.
Yep.
So it really does work well that way, and athletes know, right? I mean, the way that we kind of had structured it was we kind of gave a general warm up to start, and that gave the individual, Kat for this instance, her own window to kind of get a little bit more accurate on what she's feeling.
And we teach that.
Yeah, we kind of go
We teach
through
it.
it. Get the
Difference
awareness.
between soreness and tightness. Difference between better and worse, and how to kind of express what it is you're feeling in this time where we don't talk to you. Like we don't want to shoot the shit. We don't want to tell you anything. We don't want to talk about what the day is going to be. You go get in your zone, get in your space, and feel how you feel, right? We all understand the scientific points behind that, but the point that Chris is getting at here is, can you effectively communicate to us what you're feeling?
It's a powerful skill.
100%. And then do we kind of see or observe the same things that you're reporting to us? And with her specifically, it was very tightly.
For a professional athlete, I feel like that's like the ultimate skill to have.
100%,
Because like you
yeah.
just talked about, if you don't have an ecosystem of coaches around you and you're bouncing around whatever private team, you get traded, you've got to be able to communicate something, and I think that's a pretty powerful skill.
Absolutely.
I wanna talk about the foot has always just been something of like extreme interest to me, and I think that from an intervention standpoint, you can probably go any which direction. And one thing that I've always thought, and maybe this is like a cop out for myself, but I'm beginning to like learn more and to discover more and create better like systems of how I apply actually like looking at the foot. But I also tell myself with the population I work with and a lot of athletic populations, like just getting them out of their shoes and exposing them to potentially like different surfaces is probably like a huge win, especially with basketball players. But from an intervention process, when you're dealing with somebody that is, that has a, let's just for very broad layman's terms, like poor foot function, what are some like intervention strategies, or at least like the categories of intervention strategies that you guys take to hopefully create a better functioning foot?
Well, the categorization is SFT. It's structural, functional, technical. That applies just as we were talking about earlier, it applies the exact same here. From a structural perspective, what is the tissue quality of the foot? What is the ranges of motion of the toe? The segmentation of the foot, forefoot, midfoot, hindfoot.
Let me stop you real quick.
Yep.
And just say, for the practitioners that are listening to this, and also myself, that don't have the manual skills of manipulating a foot, feeling a foot, and if I felt a foot, I couldn't tell you what the tone of that foot was. And maybe you're working in a team setting, but you want to tackle the structural side of things. Are there, obviously it's gonna be much more watered down than you yourself with one athlete, with your hands on that athlete, but like, what are some potential strategies to at least slightly check that box when it comes to intervening to create a better functioning foot?
If you can only check two things, plantar flexion, dorsiflexion, big toe flexion, big toe extension, right? Like that's as low level as you can get.
Yeah.
Very, very, very important.
Yeah.
Right? And just, I kind of have always thought about it as like a cascade, right? Because the big toe flexion extension capability is going to be indicating for dorsiflexion, plantar flexion, which is then going to influence knee angle, which is then going to influence hip position, which is then going to influence trunk position, right? So that to me is kind of the cascade approach to it. But I think in addition to that, you don't have to have any manual skills or any kind of like, clinical background whatsoever to just be able to understand how a foot that's positioned, biasing external rotation versus biasing pronation, to just think for 20 seconds about what that could mean coming up the chain, right?
For sure.
So that's probably that part. The other thing is like, if they'll tell you, right? You'll get these contextual clues. So I've got an athlete right now whose chief complaint is that my feet feel great after the first 20 minutes of waking up. Every single morning, no matter what I do, first 20 minutes walking on the floor is painful. So what does that likely tell us? Well, the feet have been inactive for, let's assume, 8 hours, and then we go and put our feet on the ground, and then that creates some discomfort. So splaying and having the eccentric loading of the plantar surface of the foot is discomforting for them. That's probably a precursor for plantar fasciitis,
Mhm.
right? So now, what are the things that I can do in the team setting, in the strength setting, to accommodate for plantar fasciitis? And I go right back to what you just said, like, don't, the lax ball, tennis ball, like, that stuff's fine, but really it's just get out of your shoes and put some load through your foot in different positions on different surfaces and work on being able to interface and expand the foot into the ground. That's really kind of the bread and butter. The functional aspect becomes a continuation of that, where now we are just kind of looking at how can we load the foot from different positions, elevated heel, floating heel, doing different wedge patterns, things like that. And then the technical piece is where I just pawn off to Chris or Les, and then you can kind of cue into
For sure.
getting different functionality of the foot through the technical component.
So there's a couple places I would like to go, but I don't want to take too many hard left turns. But I want to go back. Let's start with when you said with Cat specifically, a big emphasis was spinal engine work.
Oh yeah, I'm glad you brought that back up.
What does that mean exactly? And because I think that it's a hot terminology within the field of performance of spinal engine work. So when you're actually incorporating that within a training program, especially for this high performing athlete, what does that mean?
So we got to think about the human organism as a whole before we get into too much of the term of spinal engine, right? The human body moves in this reciprocating manner, right? There's a left to right or right to left in everything that we do. So with that reciprocity, we have rotation that's occurring, macro and micro rotation, and then there's also this kind of side bending that's going to occur. Now, a lot of this is, pretty minuscule until we start to expose it through velocity or load, but everything that we do is reciprocating, rotational, and has bending moments to it, right? So the term spinal engine, which was popularized by Grakowetsky, I believe is how you pronounce it, in the late 80s, and then Angus Ross is a researcher who's doing a lot of really good work with this out of New Zealand. It's labeling something that we just organically and naturally do. Now, I think the important and rudiment point on this is that it should open people's eyes to stop telling people to invariably brace and stay rigid and don't do anything, don't put any load in deflection. It's silly.
Yeah.
The clear argument to this is just watch the sport and see how they move, right? So let's take soccer. Spend a lot of time on one leg. It's a lot of change direction. It's a lot of unanticipated cutting. You go and watch any soccer game, slow it down and watch it for 20 seconds, and you're going to see a lot of this, you're going to see a lot of this, and you're going to see a lot of this, right? So no differently than we train the feet, no differently than we train the body, no differently than we do anything else. We are just trying to reflect the demands of what we see in sport or in movement. So for spinal engine, to give you more of like the actual, technical answer here, we have reciprocity, we have rotation, and we have side bending. And Chris was a big influence for me on how I organized this throughout this year, but effectively the way we can look at that is looking at it as a kind of whole part whole thing, right? So let's take spinal engine as a whole, get people kind of moving side to side, up and down, a little bit of left to right, and then look at it as being kind of segmented into, okay, now let's really focus on just purely side bending, okay? And he very poignantly made a note to me the other day that side bending must include elevation and depression of opposing shoulders. You can't just do this, you have to actually elevate one side in order to side bend toward the other. Maybe he can expand on that in a minute.
Really quick, just following suit of the undulation and oscillation that happens at the pelvis, right? Because spinal engine, what we talked about it as, is more of an expression. So let's actually talk about the foot-ground interaction. So if I have a foot that is overly compliant and lax, stiffness is needed, and we might see it be expressed up the chain, right? So we might see a lack of rotation due to spinal stiffness because it was not able to be achieved down low.
Because they're gonna get it from something.
Something has
Even
to
if it's not where
work
you
from a
want it to
contractor
be.
lax perspective,
Yeah, yeah,
right? So from a bounder who has ankles and is getting a lot of propulsion there, you might see a lack of rotation up top. So one thing that we're gonna add in a lot from her loading strategy is what? Rotation. So what really helps them as a bounder is this propulsive strategy, kind of using almost this posterior fascial line. So how do we incorporate that and engage that so that she can find stiffness with timing so that we can address the component part as it catches up to kind of stabilize with the forces and velocities that she can handle and produce.
That's like that to one of the original questions of like just seeing how you interpret movement. That's like that kind of like helps piece together for me. Is like you're seeing laxity at the foot, which then results in stiffness of the upper body.
Yep.
And that could point you to the foot. Like, you know, we're seeing rigidity in this place, but we want it in this place.
Mm-hmm.
That's I'm going into real estate answer.
Yeah, but we are, so to your point about athletes feeling good. Well, expression is a really good way to see how you're feeling.
Yeah.
So expression and movement is great, and guess what? Number one way to see expression and movement is sprinting. So when you see them express at high velocities and dealing with, not just high velocities, but the loads that come with that from a vertical perspective at mid stance, what does that mean? And how are they expressing their ability to get through it? Because they're doing it, whether they're in pain or not. So how can we see that? What do we deem as good and otherwise? And how can we slowly and particularly add something that gives them more access to their strategy without it seeing it diminish over time?
So is that constant stiffness created for her, like I said, at the spine, because stiffness, the lower limb? Is that what we can point toward back pain?
That would be my assumption.
Okay.
Yes. And if we think about both the physiological and the psychological expressions of pain, the number one thing is stiff and guard, right?
Yeah.
Because the brain perceives excessive motion as
Just
being a
stretch.
threat.
Just stretch more, right?
Well,
Foam roll,
Tight,
bro.
spot.
Yeah, foam roll.
tight hamstrings.
Yeah, foam roll.
Stretch them more.
So, so yes, great point, right? Because that's taking a contextual clue and then making a poignant observation of that clue, right? Stiffness in the trunk isn't good or bad unless we understand why it's present. And for this case, it was not good. We
So then-
needed to improve it.
So you see, let's just say another case study, not the specific one, but just for my own interest. So you see stiffness in the trunk in something like when the athlete sprints. You then assess the foot or watch the foot and you're like, there's stiffness at the foot as well. And you think, well, potentially there's just like rigidity in the system because of whatever, compressive loading over 20 years, whatever it may be. What then is the strategy or approach to then tackle that issue? Like you want rotation and fluidity of the upper body. Is this kind of like the side bending rotation approach that you would take? Or like where do you take that with an athlete that has just been trained like a powerlifter potentially and there's rigidity everywhere and now you want to introduce fluidity and rotation and things like that?
I would go right between them at the hip. I would be curious on how and why their hip is extending or why it's trying to extend in that way. Right, because hip extension for us, let's say you have someone from a literal return to play, I'm in back pain, I try to stand up and I'm in pain. Well, one of the first things that any PT is going to work on is going to be making sure that you don't extend from the spine and you can extend from the hip first. And then when we work with elite sprinters or athletes, we're going to say, hey, how do we get more hip extension in order to do so? So we look at pelvic positioning to make sure that we can get more efficient hip extension while at these forces and velocities, right? So what about this key movement of hip extension is going on at the foot when it interacts with the ground and how you see the expression happen in the spine? Because it has to translate through the big power engine of your hip. So if I can deliver a lot of force and power from my hip, can my foot handle those forces? For how long can it handle those forces? And in what direction does it allow me to express those forces as I try to propel myself forward? And then how does that, as I push and alternate and reciprocate to the other side, what does that expression look like as I push from one side up through one central spine to get to the other side and do it again?
Oh, it's easy. It's simple.
Depending on what you're looking for, right? But so when we look at it from a foot ground and hip extension, perspective, hip extension is probably the one key thing that we're looking for. So how are they trying to, or how are they doing this? And then we see, oh, well, maybe this rigidity could lead to one thing, maybe it is the foot, and then we start with those, safe to fail experiments.
I've got an athlete that comes to mind off of what you were saying right there about the stiffness. It was a kind of a big body receiver in our combine class, and he was having a lot of aggravation in the anterior hip, right? Big dude, strong dude, and the definition of stiffness, right? So it puts you in a little bit of a conundrum because that stiffness is what makes him great,
Yeah.
and that is based on his physique, the way that he's going to play the game. But now we kind of take this back to our initial premise of this podcast, right? balance versus precision. If we understand that somebody's archetype, but we're getting chronic persistent pain, and we're not able to hit the field and do what we're supposed to do from the speed side or from the strength side, well, now we have a problem. So now the stiffness is truly problematic, right? So kind of consolidating and building off of what Chris was saying, address that pain site. We have too much stiffness because now we are basically unable to control the speed at which the foot is hitting the ground. It was just kind of crashing down. There was no eccentric control, right? Or they were trying to break too much through their hip flexor. So now we have to oppose the pattern and strengthen the hip flexors.
Yeah, it's interesting, this like conversation surrounding, well, right now we're talking in the spectrum of compliance to stiffness, health, performance, whatever it may be. It's like, if you're the most compliant, you're probably gonna stay pretty healthy, but you're gonna perform pretty poorly. It's like a newborn baby, you know, like, they're not gonna tear a hamstring because they have no.
You can't put enough force down. Yeah.
Like, there's just like nothing there. And I think about also in the terms of like connective tissue versus muscular reliance, and I have an individual who began training with us this summer, and he showed up like a little bit into the summer, and he's built like a gazelle in the utmost of what you could imagine. Like in what I saw from when he walked into the room to when I saw him move to when I put him on the plates, whatever it may be, like the most elastically driven individual of all time. And within 2 days, he was telling me about how his knees always hurt. He was pointing right at his patella tendon. I was like, it makes perfect sense
100%.
because you have the ultimate archetype of an elastically driven athlete, and you've never been exposed to any type of like muscular loading in your entire life.
What does time to take off?
Shoot.
3-5.
No way. You were dealing with hockey players. It's like,
Right. So you right.
no. I was thinking counter move depth. Counter move depth is like 18 centimeters.
Oh wow.
It's like, but anyways, all this to say, to your point, there's a spectrum. And like, yeah, we want athletes to be able to leverage connective tissue and move in elastic ways. But somebody like that, when I put him in a bucket this year, it's like you're the muscular deficient group for probably the rest of the time I have you, because you've just had 20 years of elastically driven loading strategies and the way that you played and probably the sprints and box jumps you did for the training for your whole entire life. And now you like have to be loaded with what I call like your kryptonite, because it is the spectrum of like finding where they need to be dosed.
Now you add on the calendar year, because that I'm going to keep reinforcing the same thing: balance and precision.
Yeah.
Right? There's a point in the year where we have to balance what their strengths are,
But
and then lean into them.
I honestly think, and I 100% agree with you, because I truly think that it's like what I deem as like a kryptonite program into a superpower program, whatever that means for that individual athlete. But I do think that this is a very extreme example of somebody where I don't even think I need to lean into his strengths, because one, I don't have him for very long.
Sure. Yeah.
And he's been dosed so much with his strength just off of like self-selected movement strategy within a sport, and also the like fact that he hasn't trained his entire life, to where I believe that I can dose him with his kryptonite for the entire time I have him, and it's probably going to be conducive to performance because he has no established floor. Like his ceiling is his ceiling, but there's no floor underneath him, and it's almost like I could dose him for the next, I'll have him for, I had 8 weeks with him, and we'll train for another until whatever, March. And I truly think, and I'm a firm believer against this most of the time with this individual, that I could dose him with just like truly like muscular loading strategies for the next couple months. And I don't think it would hinder his superpower because of how much he's already been exposed to that and the lack in which he's been exposed to his kryptonite. But I do completely agree, but I would love for you to play.
I was going to say, can I give you a counterpoint there?
Yes.
The concern that I have with that is creating access to ranges of motion that can't be controlled. And in this case specifically, if I'm that much of an elastically biased athlete, I don't have a lot of range of motion, period. I rely on very short counter movement to produce a lot of power. So if I start to load through a greater displacement, now we're taking a very stiff and very tensile connective tissue and putting it at length rapidly. And I think that that's something that does create cause for concern for me. But
the disclaimer I will put on that is I think that like if you were to look at under the hood of of my program is I think that if we're looking at a spectrum of like coaches across the board, and it's like whatever you want to deem on one side, like your power lifter that thinks that like they're gonna squat, bench, and deadlift 3 different days a week and that's their program, all the way to like the opposite of that. I would probably trend, like even my muscular deficient program, we're still gonna jump, sprint, throw, land, which is gonna give us those elastic qualities, but in like loading strategies.
Minimal effective dose stuff, yeah.
Yeah, what you guys would say is like the strength loading portion of your program, that's gonna be bilaterally based, like deeper ranges of motion, like some local tissue where I'm focusing on musculature as opposed to connective tissue. So yes, to your point, 100% agree, but I think within this particular situation, I feel confident that he's getting enough of that while the focus within my programming can shift, if that makes sense. Because even my most muscular driven program is still probably more elastically driven than most, if that makes sense.
I can see that for sure.
And it comes down to dose anyways, right? And I think that's a big part that you unconsciously are saying without the listener knowing it, right? But you're not just gonna say, oh, I'm just gonna blow this thing out the water and just completely go this. You're like, I might not need to add in a huge amount of dose.
Yeah.
He might not have a long ass period, right? He might have a short period, but the emphasis and the dosage that will be prescribed will be more muscularly based.
Correct.
Yeah,
Correct.
and the rate of that.
I always just think it's so interesting to think about that of how much do you dose of one thing before you then lean into their strengths, especially if it's like preparation for a season, then you take into account training age, and then you take into account all these other variables. And I was talking to the intern group that I was working with this summer, is like, hey, when do you transition individuals from one program to the next? And in previous years, I was like, well, I have 8 weeks, at 4 weeks you do it because it's 4 and 4 and it works out well. And now I'm realizing like that's a very naive way to transition people throughout programs to focus on like kryptonites and superpowers, because some individuals, like the one I was just talking about, probably needs a lot more exposure to his kryptonite, whereas the developed individual that's done a lot of traditional training that's been with me for a while, we can probably touch kryptonite for a while and then lean into his superpowers because we've like established a floor. And that idea of like when to transition athletes to introduce more compliance for health or introduce more stiffness for performance is like an interesting.
I really like the phrasing of ceiling and 4 there too. I've never actually thought about it as he doesn't have a 4. That's a fascinating thing. That's the $10 million question we're all trying to answer, right? Like the sensitivity and the timing piece, and you'll get a different answer on that depending on who you ask for sure. But I think the most important thing is that and you just mentioned it, but we lean into landmarks before timelines. So let's look at whatever they may be, whatever our KPIs are, focus more on those rather than just arbitrary timelines. That I'm the same way,
For
bro.
sure.
Yeah, like I want my OCD wants everything to be perfectly balanced out and whatnot. But yeah, the landmark strategy is definitely a key part for that.
Yeah.
So going backwards a little bit, so there's a couple
You keep
points.
taking us
I was
backwards,
gonna say
dude.
bookmarking over here.
Yeah, I want to
Sheesh.
Just get
You
it.
are the one with the notepad, so it makes sense that you're taking us back to certain things. I'm just flowing. But
Going way back.
I'm just-
Anyways,
Time.
so there's 2 points that I want to get to before we wrap. The first one is, especially for someone like Kat, it's a good case, the easy case that I used. You had it for 5 weeks, talking about position and balance. What is stress to her as she leaves you guys? It's like, hey, we don't want to go backwards, obviously. We've done great work for 5 weeks. So what is stress to her to prevent her from making some kind of backwards moves as she's now, hey, we did 5 weeks of awesome work. You're now out of pain. Let's keep you there. How do we do that as you leave us?
What are those strategies?
Yeah.
Yeah, the biggest thing for us is always going to be the athlete autonomy. And I know that's a very cliche answer, but I think Chris and I and Les as well do a really good job of actually educating while we have them with us. And everything that we're doing is really a literacy process that we're putting in piece by piece. Teach the starting 6, teach the different prep strategies, the specific prep strategies. Hey, this is why we're using a landmine instead of using a conventional barbell. And we all have athletes that are on both ends of the spectrum of this too. For some of them, they don't give a shit about anything we have to say. Everything goes in one ear out the other. Not the case for her, right? Like she's very, very leaning into this, very much leaning into this. So, trying to develop it autonomously through the athlete is number 1, and then number 2, and this is somewhat of the business side of it as well, is we have a phone to pick up. Give us a call, get us in touch with your team. We'll get on a Zoom. We'll try to do everything that we can from afar, and we do have some things that we're kind of putting together in that sense of being able to be as much in touch as possible from whatever, 5,000 miles away.
Right. Yeah, and I think, when she was out here, obviously, a lot of time on task with Danny, which means she's getting world-class work.
Right.
So what that allows is it allows a longer window. Sometimes Danny, or any good practitioner gets 5 minutes, creates a window, throughout this 5 weeks, and with these, add interventions and strategies, the windows, we believe, has kind of been a little extended, especially with her improvements and her testing going back. All of her numbers and data has come back even better than what we had projected. So for her, it becomes kind of those management strategies. So when we talked to her yesterday, kind of giving her this empowerment that now that we have the ability to kind of get into these other shapes and positions, we now have to strengthen it with enough, let's say, quality components so that you can have access to these positions, shapes, and patterns more frequently, right? So now that she's on her own a little bit in that sense, but obviously we're a phone call away, and then we're actually going to be in touch with their staffs and everything, and we're technically doing, running some online programming as well. But with that, her feeling empowered enough, educated enough, so that she knows, okay, if I can at least try to capitalize on these now low-hanging fruit that give me these repositionings and these strengthened positions, now I'm not just feeling better, I feel a little bit more empowered and confident when I go onto the field.
Empowered. That was what I was going to say too. Is like the belief effect, right? When you work with that, this goes well beyond CAP, but when you work with athletes who have dealt with injury and pain, and especially over a long period of time, the belief gets eviscerated throughout that they come to this acceptance of, like you were saying, Hunter, my left knee's gonna hurt.
For sure.
We're gonna play 30 games this year. For 28 of them, I'm gonna feel like shit, right? And you just kind of settle into that. And so when you're able to remove that barrier, that blockade, and allow them to not just listen to what we're saying, but them to be able to feel firsthand, there's this kind of incarnation moment of, oh my God, I can feel good and perform well, and that's exciting.
I love the idea of like empowerment too, because, and this might be getting a little, I don't know, anyways, but we've had the conversation of like, would you ever want to work with one athlete? And it's like, would you want to work with like 2 athletes, professional athletes? And it's like, yeah, it's interesting, but then it's like, I think logistically of like these athletes traveling all over like during the off season, it's like I don't want to travel all over but you like introduce how you can like feel how your body feels, some simple loading strategies that you can do, and it's like you don't need to handhold them through everything. Obviously, when they're with you,
especially when they're so far away.
It's a disservice,
when they're with you, obviously you're handling the process and helping them, but it's also like they're not always going to be with you, and there's going to be situations where they're going to be training, warming up, doing stuff without you. So it's super beneficial to like give them the skills to kind of like walk away from you and be like, if I were to walk into a facility right now with no coach, could I train myself? And I think that it's pretty empowering, especially in this situation where she's going to be 5,000 miles away, to be like, yeah, I can do it. And it's obviously not like she's going to be doing manual therapy on her foot. Maybe she is, I don't know.
No, but
like
being
tools to
informed,
Yeah.
right, and understanding resources. The advantage that the world that we live in is that if you have a Wi-Fi connection, you can find the answer to just about anything. So
And knowing the difference between good and bad care.
for sure,
You know?
100%,
So huge.
absolutely. That's a great point too. Yeah,
And I think there's nothing, this is obvious, so it's an obvious statement, but there is nothing that will garner trust more quickly than I was in pain and now I'm not.
Oh,
So
oh,
that is
100%.
the athlete that you work with for the rest of their career.
That's
Yeah.
probably the
Yeah.
number one thing,
Yeah.
honestly,
As
more
obvious
so
as it
than
is,
performance improvements.
You're in for life then, and you can do it well, and then
it's the reason why I can probably speak for him in saying this. It's the reason why I chose this path.
Yeah.
Because, and I think I remember when I started messing around with some kids. That was poor phrasing. Started working with some kids.
Cut that out.
Started working with some kids in Texas for the first time, and I'm coming out of the SEAL thing and whatever, and I'm like, all right, I put up like a random tweet. I'm like, all right, working with kids for the first time. Let me know, what should I expect? And I got so many replies on that.
Dude, I
tweet.
remember that tweet actually.
It's funny, yeah. I got so many replies on that, and everything was the same. It was like, oh, you're gonna hate him, you're gonna want to choke him, and then little Timmy's gonna go jump 20 inches, and you're gonna see the look on his face, and it's gonna mean everything to you. And then I gave it a shot, man. I did, and I didn't really give a shit about that kid's jump, man. It didn't do anything for me, But I recognized after the fact that what I was comparing it against was this, which is that and I'm not trying to glorify any of this or make this a point about me, but you take people that have been in debilitating pain, you take people that have amputations, you take people that have been diagnosed with cancers, and you're able to kind of make impacts on those worlds. I don't give a shit about your counter movement jump, man.
Yeah.
This is what really charges me up, you know, and that's where we're at now.
I'm gonna pull a mic right now and
The fuck is that?
and take us back. There's a question that's a little bit of like a nuanced, precise question, but I wanted to ask it. And you mentioned very early on in the conversation about Cat and how, or no, it was about just when you're working with when you guys are working with an athlete that is coming back from injury, and the first few sessions, weeks, you're not really worried about like collecting data per se.
Yeah.
And then you do go through a process of like collecting data. How valuable do you think it is for a practitioner that has again, I'll put this in quotes, healthy athlete, because what is a healthy athlete? But an athlete that's not in like a major return to play setting, to get objective data on local tissue from isometric testing? Or do you think, because I think I've like talked to and heard a lot of practitioners speak, and it seems like that's like this new thing, I don't want to say trendy, but like becoming more popular, like let's assess local tissue.
Right.
Let's assess.
Let's create our own normative data.
Lower leg, whatever. Leg extension, whatever it may be. I mean, Nordics is the thing that everybody always does on the Nordic board. But like, how important do you think it would be for preliminary testing to assess separate local tissue and potentially like their force producing capacities?
Yeah, not very. Yeah, I know it's probably an unpopular answer. I think the further away or the more removed we are from the game, from the sport itself, the less significance or importance something has, right? And I've used this example a couple of times this year on different things, but like, not to dodge the question here, but let's think about range of motion testing for a second, right? And we think about hip internal rotation, right? It's a trendy thing, right? It's the hip IR, hip IR deficit, or
Yeah.
they're an anterior tilt, whatever, right? Well, the three fastest athletes that we had in our combine group all had less than 12 degrees of hip internal rotation.
Wow.
Less than 12,
Wow.
right? So if you look at that in a clinical sense, like that is red flag.
Bed rest,
Boom.
maybe.
Yeah, problem. Yeah, bed rest, exactly. Right? So good kind of, real life example of just taking these things with a grain of salt. Now, when we take it to the injury sense, I think that there is a commercialized demand, whether we're talking about in the organizational setting or we're talking about in a private PT clinic that's backed by insurance pays, that we have to demonstrate the value of our work. And because we can't put them on VBT, or we may not be able to put them on a force plate or have them run a 10, well, we don't really have very much we can show over here, so let's come up with something and bring out the goniometer. I say that somewhat facetiously. The numbers become more important as we go along. I'll give you an example on this. We have a kid that we've been working with, youth athlete, who's coming off of a stress fracture in his foot. And we were aiming for, our date was yesterday, right? It was his first practice. Leading up to that point, over the last 4, 5, 6 weeks, right, we started implementing more and more and more testing. We started to see a positive trend across everything. And then on Wednesday, the force plate testing on his CMJ, he still had what was about 40% bias between jump effort on right and left foot. So we kind of like got to this point where we were trending towards being ready for that first practice, and then we saw that on Wednesday, and we immediately called the parents. Hey, we should probably hold on that, right? So for me, and again, I think I can speak for Chris here, the force plate testing is fantastic. It supports, it does not drive our decision making. So we have our belief or opinion or statement on where somebody's at in the timeline or where they're at in this process, and then we have these numbers that are beneath it that, okay, this is gonna confirm, probably not ready yet, right? And it works on both ends, right? Same thing with the CAT process. Like, we saw what we were seeing, we saw these improvements and this progress, and then we did our post testing for the range of motion, and we saw, and I shit you not, a 54 and a 77% increase in hip external rotation on left and right hip. 54 and 77% difference. That's enormous, right? But we don't necessarily drive our decisions off of these micro tests throughout. We collect it because it's important, we analyze it at the end of the week, and then we support decisions moving forward off of that.
I have another like random question.
Send it, we're on a roll.
We do have to wrap up eventually, but sure.
I mean, we got 15 minutes. So having another discussion with another athlete, and we've been talking this whole time on like a return to play from, let's say, like an acute injury, an ACL tear, whatever it may be. I was having a conversation with an athlete the other day, and he said that in high school, he played 100 games of basketball in the month of June, leading into his senior year of high school.
Congratulations.
Impossible.
Yeah. Oh,
I know. He said he was literally playing like about 3 games a day. And again, maybe he's exaggerating a little bit, but all this to say is he played a shit ton of basketball. And he said that from that month forward, his, mostly like his knees, patella tendon, whatever it may be, are like shot. And not just like not like an acute, like, that's just like a chronic buildup of too much volume. And now it's set him back like years, it seems like. That's not necessarily like an acute injury. It's just like, in my head, it's just like this buildup over time to now it's like a chronic issue. When you're looking at something like that, and I know that's a really extreme example, but like when you're looking at something like that, does your mind go to the same place in terms of like return to play, regeneration with a situation like that, as opposed to like an acute boom ACL tear? Let's try to return them to play from that.
Balance and precision. You know, so if we have a situation like that, and obviously that the first thing that came to my mind with that was early specialization, which I'm learning is absolutely egregious. Seriously.
I mean, in basketball, it's like out of
And
control.
especially
bro, in
working in
soccer.
the rehabilitation space with, especially now with the younger population.
It sucks, man.
Yeah.
Like it really does, and there's a moral conflict to it as well, where you know, you see the parents and the parents of youth athletes are the exact same people as the agents of professional athletes.
Yeah.
They're the exact
That's
same,
great, yeah.
maybe a little bit more well intended, but it's a hard thing to kind of indict them on, because if like I always look at it like this: if the opposition is the parent just lets them play video games and feeds them Cheetos and McDonald's and shit, like, all right, give me the crazy parent who's going to send their kid in with 86 cut marks on their back. Give me that, right? But at the same time, we really have this misconception of more is better. And we have to understand and be able, and this is a part of our fundamental responsibility as coaches or practitioners, is being able to articulate and convey to the parent that more is not better, more is more, right? And then here's what those potential consequences are. So for the case with the basketball athlete is very similar to this stress fracture that we were just talking about. And what I'm now, again, abruptly being kind of made aware of is the rate of stress fractures in these youth athletes is insane. Now to tie in another point that we've been talking about here too with the connective tissue stuff as well, with youth athletes, the ligaments actually develop faster than the bone tissue when they're in that prepubescent and kind of going through that prepubescent period. So the reason why we see so many stress fractures is because the ligaments are actually stronger than the bone tissue, and we are getting chronic pulling on the bones, which is then creating fractures, or in really bad cases, avulsion fractures, right? So we have way too much precision, way too much specific input, doing the same recurring stress over and over and over and over again without complementing it with the appropriate balance. The best thing almost any kid between 10 and 15 can do is just go be a kid for a month. Like, just go be a kid,
When you think about your daughter's athletic career, you're like, hey, I gotta put her in sports. I want her to explore movement exploration. What do you think of? Oh, I want to give her balance and precision as she starts to take on the athletic world, if that's something she decides to do.
God help that coach. Yeah.
Because you're the dad, or because she's the athlete?
Either or.
Parents are the parents.
Yeah, I feel the same way.
The only rule that we have in our household is she cannot specialize until she is at the very earliest 15 years old, and she has to be very good.
Okay.
If you're not good, if you're trash, you can't specialize. And if you're younger than 15, you cannot specialize. It's not gonna happen. You do whatever else you want. Do chess club, book club, soccer, basketball.
There's something
volleyball.
about 15, that age.
Maturity, physical maturity.
Okay.
Yeah, and I specifically want variability up to that point. I want her to do as many different things as possible up until that point, and then again, like, if you're actually good at this, if you really are a good soccer player, she's only been allowed to watch Katarina Macario highlights for the last 7 weeks now, 8 weeks now. If she ends up being very good, then we'll pursue that, we'll invest in that. But otherwise, 99% chance you're not going pro. let's have some fun through high school, maybe a little bit of college, and let's move on.
Yeah.
All right, so there's a couple of things that we never got to, but I think that's okay, because I think that overall there's a lot of topics covered in this.
You can probably hit one more.
All right, we can try to go fairly quickly. My question was, well, maybe two-part question. No, I'll make it a one-part question. When you think about the differences between ligaments, tendons, and musculature, and you think about that return process, are there major things that come up as these would change depending on if it's like an Achilles tendon, like that actual tendon structure, versus a ligament versus a back tear? Or is it like generally structure is the exact same, and we're just gonna go?
You know, we don't-
I was gonna say, we kind of just recently talked about this yesterday, 2 days ago, just from a brief perspective. When ligaments kind of become more lax, right, there's that integrity of space and the acuity of awareness and spatial awareness has now been altered, right? So your body has to organize and compensate, if we're gonna use that word, around this newly found spatial laxity, right? So the structures are important. We were talking about it between ligaments and tendons. So when the ligament has now created or there's some laxity, which means there's now more available space and possibly some more available just ranges, how does your body adapt and stabilize that? So sometimes we have to use certain musculature or tendons to kind of almost act in place of those ligaments, right? Making sure that they can kind of contract and pull you into those ranges and spaces that are now kind of ambiguously there due to this ligament laxity for whatever reason. But I would kind of defer to you when we talk about more tendon stuff, because the ligament laxity is there, so you kind of have to work with it. Whereas a lot of times procedurally with tendons, we get a little bit more out of that.
Chris thinks all chiros are the Antichrist, by the way.
See, I don't know why you'd be saying that, because I also tell him every time he says that, some of the smart people I know are chiros by trade, right? Anyways, before I get canceled for some shit.
Yeah, you're about to cancel.
Yeah, some chiros are gonna be like, come on bro, I'll snap your neck, and I'll be like, please don't, but I mean, again, there's a lot of intelligent people, and I think even to our surgical point that we made,
Yeah.
professions, they're good, there's bad, there's better, and
Every
there's worse.
profession,
Yeah.
So a title is a title in the end, if we can just be,
I just had that conversation with my girlfriend about chiros.
I was gonna say about relationships, that's tough. I was like, you are a bold man.
About chiros, getting good.
The all jokes aside, the laxity of ligaments is a very important thing, and and as Chris is mentioning here, like that to me, when I think about ligament injuries, I immediately think isometrics. When I have tendon injuries, I immediately think eccentrics. And of course, that doesn't mean we only exclusively do one for one, but predominantly for ligaments, I'm going to think more isometric, and then for tendons, I'm going to think more eccentric. For muscles, I'm going to think both, right? I'm going to think of, because with the length tension relationship, right, we want to think about both the elongated and the contracted or compressed state. With the fascial injuries, we want to think about the multidirectional nature of movement, right? So the term for connective tissue in general is anesiotropic. And in other words, with fascia, the direction of load or force is going to change the length tension properties. So it's very important with fascial-based injuries that we have, different planes and different directions of movement. The other thing that I think I've kind of adopted, well, I definitely have adopted and really have found a lot of success with this in a short period of time is Keith Barr's principles. Now, he only really speaks to tendon, right? But he kind of hints at some other things too, he just doesn't really say it outright. But with the long duration isometrics, I think that's an absolutely brilliant application, and it's a very easy one, right? Take any position, put them in the exact, angles and articulate how you want it, and then have them hold it for an extended period of time. And essentially what that's doing is it's a fatiguing mechanism. So you're basically fatiguing what's already strong in the area and then forcing different fiber types and even different tissue types to become activated through this longer duration of isometrics. So with this, I mentioned the calf example with the athlete we have right now. Our warm-up is progressively building into long and longer duration isometrics where we treat it like a dimmer rather than a switch. So if we're going to do a 60-second isometric on, single leg calf iso, first 20 seconds, about 50%. Next 20 seconds, about 75%. Last 20 seconds, gun it, full go.
Oh, so I was thinking yielding. This is overcoming.
This is actually just really positional first, right? So just freestanding isometric and then would go to overcoming.
Got it.
Yeah, so it would be an overcoming application,
Got
right? And that's actually the other thing I wanted to mention too, is that we've fully have adopted the Natero protocols, which I think are really great. I really like those a lot, yeah.
So this might be totally wrong, so please correct me if this is. A tendon surgical repair, the actual tendon shortens after repair.
Correct, yes.
Ligament repair is the same length, it's just modified with whatever I'm pulling from.
There's a technical answer that's probably out of my scope, but with the tendon example, yes, you're correct in almost all cases. With the ligament example, I think that kind of goes back to more of the quality or the preference of the surgeon and how taut do they want that, and based on how old the person is and what their demand is, they will tension that ligament differently based on that context.
Gotcha.
Got it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just think, because like, again, and as I've thought about, and I'm sure most performance coaches think about, it's like, oh, this person's coming off an Achilles surgery. Like, they're a healthy athlete all of a sudden, like, again, after that period of time. They now have a fully functioning Achilles. Well, it's a different Achilles.
Yes,
It's a significantly different
yes,
tissue than it was previously.
yeah,
But then it gets treated as if it was the previous or the first tissue.
right.
So there's clearly this disconnect between, once that happens and my Achilles is now literally shorter, right? The way that I interact with that athlete now compared to what it was has to be different. But it doesn't get treated that way in 99.9% of cases.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot more depth to that,
Right.
for sure. You know, because like the Achilles specifically, like we think about the winding and the unwinding of the Achilles. Like most people think about the Achilles and they just think about the longitudinal pull, but there's actually really a coiling mechanism of the Achilles and how it is going to create tension and then expand and then transmit energy from that point. So that's another factor that gets probably overlooked a lot, is when we have a rupture and now we have
I
a
don't think
suture.
it's like that, so yeah.
Sutured Achilles. Well, what you'll notice with Achilles ruptures is there's going to be a much greater restriction in inversion and eversion,
Okay.
right? And I think a part of that is because of the tightness rather of the tendon because of the suturing, right? So yeah, things to think about.
Yeah.
I feel like we could wrap for a while longer, but unfortunately we are probably coming to a close.
Yep.
Probably for time's sake and for the fact that you're a 3-time guest and you're a back-to-back guest pretty much, probably not gonna hit our last question with these two. Or do we think we should?
Unless you guys have something that's front of mind.
What is it?
Our last question, powered by 1080 motion, let's do rapid fire, if you guys have them. Powered by 1080 motion, what is something that you do or think that a majority of the field would disagree with? This, you've already answered it twice.
Or maybe more than that in this conversation.
Or maybe more. But if you guys wanna throw one answer out, rapid fire.
Oh no, Chris is leading on this. But
Let's go with the idea that a lot of times treatment is passive.
Mhm.
And that athletes can walk in, lie on a table, usually go on their phone, have no actual cortical integration or awareness of what's actually being done to them, and they kind of hop off the table and believe that they should be fixed.
Majority of treatments.
Right,
Yeah.
so the idea of fixing something might be closer to an issue, but it's not solving a problem. And that does take action. There needs to be, to what Danny was even saying, there needs to be a reaction. In order for there to be a reaction, something needs to take action. So in that sense, I would say maybe that is a little not seen as much in our field as we may like it to be.
No, I
But I think it's also a little bit on our job to educate the athlete from that perspective too. Going back to this empowerment, that's probably another indicator, because then we have people out there who are able to help or fix issues, but doesn't necessarily always help a problem. And then if the athlete does have reoccurring issues or injuries, well, now we're losing trust with the people that were supposed to help us.
Sure.
So now it kind of creates this, secular effect, where all of a sudden, I have trust, it didn't work, now I'm losing trust, then I go somewhere else to find trust, and now the athlete kind of feels left in space.
I mean, I can definitely see that most of the field would disagree with that, and if they agree with that, they're just, I don't know.
Maybe not agree, disagree, but it's just the reality of the
It's
field.
the reality.
Yeah, yeah.
Like the majority of quote-unquote treatments that I see,
And when you bring attention to it, it's like, oh yeah, that's powerful.
there probably should be some conscious movement going on from a treatment perspective.
In order for your body to piece it together and
Yeah.
self-organize,
Yeah.
it should be aware of what the fuck's going on.
Somebody bending and twisting your foot is probably,
Or it's like, when a sport coach comes into the weight room, like the collegiate setting, and they're like, they want to see action happening.
Yeah.
They're like, oh, this is good.
Push sleds and
And when they walk into
battle
the
ropes.
training room, as long as the person's physically on the table,
Yeah.
this is good.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Right. Very different things, right?
Yeah, very true. Well, fellas.
Well, Danny, do you have an answer for that? Jesus Christ.
That was
Oh,
great.
I'm sorry.
No.
He said he was gonna let Chris rattle.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, let's leave on that.
This was our first podcast in this type of setting.
This
And it
is.
was awesome, and I honestly enjoyed it a lot more than obviously over a computer, but unfortunately logistics create the inability to do this more often, but I'm glad that we were able to do this with you guys and you guys in particular.
Well, we can announce on the podcast that you're moving to San Diego, yeah?
That's gonna be news to Leah, and she's gonna be pissed. She's not gonna listen to this, so maybe we could. I'm not moving to San Diego, but thank you guys, appreciate your time.
Before you guys go,
Yes.
you have a couple things coming up together, and then also you have a lot going on separately. Can you just plug where to find you, what's going on? Chris?
Hell, do we got going on, yeah? I guess we got this USR thing coming up, so we'll be doing that in September, so we'll be out in Texas. Really excited to be a part of USR, Universal Speed Rating. That was pretty much started by Les Bellman, and then obviously a lot of good education team members and just good overall people that will be there attending as well. And then I know that in November, I believe we have something scheduled with an MLB team over in your area.
Sure.
So I believe those are kind of the main things. Let me know if I missed anything in particular.
No?
Resources that people could tap into to learn more from you guys?
Danny, you Controlling Chaos is about to start
Monday.
Monday.
Yeah.
Fuck
Yep.
All right.
Yeah.
So we got
Third
Controlling
cohort
Chaos.
this year. Yep.
And then Danny and I actually this week have been talking about, hopefully coming out with some sort of free resource on about feet and lower leg stuff. So,
Sweet.
and here in the next month or two, we'll have some extra free resources for people that are interested out
Yeah,
there.
I'll tap into that for sure.
Will there be pictures of your feet specifically on there?
Yeah, you'll be able to tell.
It's
You'll be able
VIP
to tell.
price. Yeah.
Well, cool, fellas. Thank you. Appreciate your time.
Yeah.
Cool.
Awesome.
Appreciate you guys.
Thank you, guys.
It's been great.
Fuck yeah, man. That was awesome. All right.
Alright.
In the books, dude.
Can't wait till we hear like,
Yeah,
oh, I
that's-
forgot to hit record.
Oh shit.
Oh, wait, can we restart?
Audio.